Gibraltar, cradle of history. Those are the words visitors can see carved in a commemorative monument as they enter the rock across the airport's runway. Throughout the years, numerous experts and researchers have revealed the countless secrets that for centuries had been kept hidden within the rock's interior and subsoil. Treading into Gibraltar's history implies moving along a path where the most ancient myths, the most exciting legends, and the veracity of equally exciting historical facts get intertwined. Since ancient times, the rock's evocative shapes have been considered home to gods and goddesses, and the scene for mythological epic poems. Among the latter, the most widely known is perhaps the one that sees in the rock's imposing morphology the remains of one of the pillars on which Hercules leaned to separate Europe from Africa. The current speculations about the existence of the most astounding means for electronic warfare in the rock's base, the testimonies of those who assert there is a secret nuclear submarine base inside the rock, or the recurring allusion to a mysterious tunnel that supposedly joins Gibraltar and Africa under the strait, only contributes to refresh the special connection among myth, legend, and reality upon which Gibraltar's history is built. The World War II period is no stranger to these components. Quite the opposite. The amazing stories about spies and saboteurs, General Sikorsky's mysterious death, or the secret plans to seize the rock, constitute such a fertile field that many times it poses a real challenge to researchers to distinguish between historical facts and stories that do not go beyond the sphere of myths or legends. But sometimes there is the wonderful experience of finding a veracity element behind what, until then, had been considered nothing but a legend. That was the case of one of the most curious stories which occurred during the last big military conflict. We're talking about Stay Behind Cave, a mission where, if Gibraltar was occupied by the Wehrmacht, a group of British soldiers would remain hidden in a molehill in order to report all the enemy movements in the surroundings of the strategic base. The secret around the whole matter, and the security requirements that marked the Cold War period, contributed to erase the trace of the Stay Behind Cave story, and to make it gradually appear to be doomed to enlarge the collection of thrilling legends that ornate Gibraltar. Nevertheless, the rumours that vehemently supported the veracity of the story kept alive the interest of Gibraltarian researchers, who for many years developed a prodigious tracing activity aimed at proving that Stay Behind Cave was more than just a legend.
Rumours of Operation Tracer, of course, were just that. In post-war Gibraltar, where a local community would talk about rumours of a secret chamber. And of course it was 1997 when the Gibraltar Caving Group finally discovered it. Well, officially discovered it. Other rumours suggested that army personnel had used it as an operational post during operations during the 70s, but not realising its actual significance. However, in 1997, Gibraltar Caving Group did make the official discovery, and a survey was done, and of course it was the scene of one of the most top secret missions of World War II. Operation Tracer, of course, was the official name for the mission. Locally it was referred to as Stay Behind Cave, more as an affectionate term.
I first heard of Operation Tracer on arrival in Gibraltar in 1989, and I heard it from a local historian and a good friend of mine, Tito Vallejo, who talked about these Stay Behind Caves. It also mentioned, and we'd spoke about, two-man operations called Operation Monkey. Intrigued by what these were, I started to do a little digging of my own to find out a little more on the history side of what Operation Monkey or Operation Tracer was. The cave has been visited on a number of occasions by other people. I know of several people that have been in there but didn't understand what they were in. The Gibraltar Caving Group, I believe, were the guys who actually realised the significance of what they'd walked into, and that they'd stumbled across Operation Tracer Cave, or as they've named it, the Stay Behind Cave. Tracer was so secretive that only the team and the shadow team that is referred to would have known that Operation Tracer was going in.
Nobody knew where this site was. He conducted many searches around Gibraltar looking for this elusive place, which we knew had been designed for troops to stay buried alive, to spy on the enemy, if Gibraltar had fallen to the Germans. He called it Operation Monkey, but then it was renamed Operation Stay Behind and eventually Operation Tracer.
After formulating various theories about the cave's possible location and overcoming the difficulties of moving within a closed access area that was property of the British Ministry of Defence, and consequently subject to understandable restrictions, the enthusiasts of this matter spent almost 2 unsuccessful decades trying to determine the cave's emplacement. But since those who seek the impossible are rewarded by the gods, in December 1996, after coming across an unexpected gust of wind, some members of the Gibraltar caving group discovered, almost by chance, a mysterious chamber camouflaged behind the tunnel wall near Lord Airy's battery. They enlarged the original hole on the outer wall and finally got access to a complex of chambers which had remained closed for more than half a century. They immediately came to the conclusion that they had found irrefutable evidence that Stay Behind Cave, far from being a war legend, was a tangible reality. This complex of chambers was soon declared Area of Archaeological Interest, and although still the property of the British Ministry of Defence, it is currently being researched under the Gibraltar Museum's responsibility. The supporting documentation of the story was soon found among the files of the National Archives in Kew Gardens, England, more specifically in the collection related to the British Naval Intelligence, documents that had been declassified as a result of the new Freedom of Information Act in Britain. The story could be finally rounded out thanks to the work of the researchers Jim Crone, Peter Jackson and Martin Nuza, who were able to get in touch with the only living protagonist of the story, a veteran medical officer of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve called W.A. Bruce Cooper, who, despite being 92 years old, had the memories of that event etched in his mind. Thanks to these scholars and researchers' perseverance, it could be finally proved how much truth lay behind a story, a new version of the Trojan horse, a version full of finesse and heroism set in Gibraltar. A story that, after half a century, had come to us under the evocative popular name of Stay Behind Cave. The idea of setting up an advanced observation post in case the colony fell into the hands of the Germans aroused the interest of the British Naval Intelligence by the end of the summer of 1941. This was a specific moment of the conflict. It happened just a few months after the beginning of the Russian campaign. And what is even more curious, it was a moment in which the risk of Spain going to war, and therefore letting the Wehrmacht go through the peninsula and seize the rock, had stopped being imminent since the previous winter. At that time, more than half a year had passed by since Hitler had called off the arrangements for the so-called Operation Felix, because it was impossible for him to implement it without hampering what he considered the real Third Reich conquering war, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In the early part of that summer, the German divisions had attacked Russia in search of the desired Lebensraum, the vital place in the vast eastern lands. This was a strategic bet, which was supported from the very writing of Mein Kampf in the 30s, and which had made the Führer hold out hope of a new world order, one where Germany could provide for their basic needs and the continent, while leaving the control of the overseas territories to Great Britain, its potential ally. But for Germany, defeating the Soviet Union meant much more than finishing off its main ideological opponent. It was also a way to convince the British of their defeat and strip them of their little hope of victory. Besides, if the German blitzkrieg victory in the east was combined with the greatest submarine and aerial pressure against the British naval traffic, the British might even consider the possibility to negotiate a retreat earlier than expected. As the first movements of Operation Barbarossa started developing, the idea of an impending defeat of the Soviet Union began to gain ground. In view of the huge devastation, the millions of captured prisoners, and the fierce German advance, it was difficult to imagine a different ending to this new lightning campaign than the Wehrmacht's victory. However, the splendid initial victories of Operation Barbarossa did not take their toll on the will of resistance of the British, who, relying on their empire and on American support, would remain firm even if that meant shedding more blood, sweat and tears. By the end of the summer of 1941, The battles where Bialystok, Minsk and Smolensk were annihilated had already taken place. Kiev was about to fall. Leningrad was besieged, and the Wehrmacht was already preparing the assault on Moscow. At that time, many people from both camps were convinced that the Soviet military power was on the verge of being devastated. Within the British naval means, people were confident that if the German forces repeated the success of their previous campaigns, the Third Reich's attention and military power would soon turn to the Mediterranean once again. It's a well-known fact that in order to control the traffic across the Mediterranean, it was pivotal to take possession of the three key strategic points of the theatre of operations. Those were Alexandria, its eastern entrance, Gibraltar, its western entrance, and that kind of traffic officer located at the very heart of the sea, the island of Malta. Since February 1941, the Germans had been supporting the Italian deployment in Libya, sending units that were later known as Africa Corps, which were commanded by General Erwin Rommel. These units had helped the Italians avoid collapsing after the last British counter-offensive that had finished with the loss of the important Tobruk harbour. But during the summer in Africa, the Axis powers, spurred on by German support, had managed to get back into the game and even expel the British from Cyrenaica. With the foreseeable Russian defeat, enough forces would be released not only to help Rommel reach Alexandria, but also to reactivate the suspended Operation Felix against Gibraltar. And who could assure that this time Franco's cautious reluctance would not end up buried by the euphoria of the great victory over the Bolshevik? If the Africa Corps managed to capture Alexandria and Gibraltar fell to the Wehrmacht's assault units, Malta would also end up succumbing to the Italo-German naval and aerial pressure. Thus, in the autumn of 1941, the possibilities of Great Britain being expelled from the Mediterranean were so palpable that the British naval intelligence began to seriously consider a way of gathering reliable information about the naval traffic across the Mediterranean once the whole theatre of operations had fallen into enemy hands. It was basically this necessity which led the British Department of Naval Intelligence to conceive the so-called Operation Tracer. In short, it involved the installation of secret observation posts, isolated from the outside, in the strategic points of the enemy's rear guard. Those observation posts would be equipped with all the necessary supplies so that a selected staff was able to survive 1 year and send the required information. As regards the Mediterranean, the proposed enclaves to study the location of these modern Trojan horses were, not surprisingly, Malta, the harbour of Aden at the exit of the Red Sea, and the Rock of Gibraltar. In the autumn of 1941, the Gibraltar garrison was marching against the clock to turn the colony into a fortress worthy of such name. Months before, the civilians had been evacuated from Gibraltar, and not only the Gibraltar garrison, but also the artillery crew were constantly getting reinforcements through the arrival of new units. The greatest effort was focused on the excavation of tunnels and underground premises for the garrison to use as shelter, the strengthening of the artillery positioning, and the fortification of the old airfield's exterior, as well as the extension of its runway. Gibraltar was rapidly getting ready to resist an assault. In the planning of the excavation work, priority was given to the complexes that were located southward and northward within the rock. New galleries were opened, and annexed to them several warehouses, shelters, hospitals, command posts and quarters for the troops. These chambers would finally be joined by the well-known tunnels Fosse Way and Great North Road, which provided a solid tactic unity to the imposing network of tunnels and galleries that would be, along with the airport, one of the great legacies that World War II left to the colony. As a matter of fact, in March 1941, two new Royal Engineer companies, identified with the numbers 178 and 170, joined the sappers from 180 Company and the well-known section of the No. 1 Company Royal Canadian Engineers, who had been working in Gibraltar for almost a year. The arrival of these new companies had led to a significant increase in the digging rate, so much so that, thanks to the combined effort of these units, the building works at Fordham's Flats, Liddell Union, McFarlane Gallery and Gort's Hospital were finished, and many others were started in the eastern and southern areas of the rock. Among them was Lord Airy's Tunnel. As a result of this huge effort, as the year 1941 wore on, the idea of turning Gibraltar into a fortress began to leave the sphere of propaganda and become a reality. However, the British realized that the garrison's resistance ability in the event of an enemy assault was still limited, and in a matter of weeks, or maybe days, the colony would end up in the hands of the Wehrmacht assault powers. The British had always bargained for the possibility of losing Gibraltar. That is evidenced by the fact that, in parallel with the defensive tactics, they decided to take some measures in case Gibraltar was finally occupied by the German powers, despite every effort. One of those measures was the preparation of a big hollow in the east side of the rock, so that in the event of an emergency, the governor of Gibraltar could escape from the fortress in a submarine. However, the most heroic initiative was without question all the activities related to Operation Tracer. It's already been pointed out that for Great Britain, as it had been for Germany or Italy before, it was vital to be informed about the shipping activity across the strait. But if Spain went to war in support of the Axis powers, and the Germans succeeded in capturing Gibraltar, the British naval intelligence would find it extremely difficult to keep stable observation posts on both sides of the strait. It's also been mentioned that the whole Mediterranean naval traffic moved around three basic spots: Gibraltar, Alexandria and Malta. But in the autumn of 1941, the British knew that although they had reconquered Cyrenaica, Rommel was still very far from Alexandria, and they counted on Churchill's willingness to continue sending reinforcements to the north of Africa. On the other hand, there was no reason to anticipate the imminent fall of Malta. However, there existed some belief that once the Russian campaign was over, Gibraltar could turn into Hitler's next target. Capturing Gibraltar not only ensured the control over the French colonies in the north of Africa, but also allowed to send Rommel all the troops he needed to reach the Suez Canal. Taking all this into account, some members of the British Naval Intelligence met at the personal residence of their director, Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, at 36 Curzon Street, Mayfair, London, and agreed that of the three basic spots mentioned before, the place where the first tracer team had to be sent was the British colony of Gibraltar. Before long, SO-1 Gibraltar Commander Geoffrey Burleigh received instructions from London to find a suitable place to locate an observation post where the first tracer group of the British Naval Intelligence had to be established. In this regard, because of its height and geological disposition, the morphology of the rock presented clear possibilities. It did not have to be very hard to find a suitable place to locate an underground complex capable of housing a team of 6 men, their equipment and supplies for a year. The complex had to be placed in the upper half of the rock, where the height above sea level would offer them the required perspective. And what was even more important, the north-south disposition of the rock and the gradually sharpened borders of its higher areas could let only one team, with all the necessary building, climb a hill on the east side to take in all the Mediterranean area, and at the same time another hill on the west side to keep under observation the area of the strait, the bay, and the ports of Gibraltar and Algeciras. Burleigh knew that they only had to be a little bit alert to find the place. Clearly, if someone could help him find what he was looking for, that was the chief engineer, Colonel H.M. Fordham, someone who knew the interior of the rock very well, as he was the chief engineer responsible for every excavation done in Gibraltar since 1940. Fordham answered to Burleigh's call, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel A.R. Hay, his predecessor in the position, and another tunnel rat, who was now second in command. For several days, Burleigh, Fordham and Hay inspected numerous parts and sections of the current excavations. Finally, they chose a location at 411.48 metres above sea level, near the so-called Lord Airy's Battery. The complex near this battery, known as Lord Airy's Tunnel, was a recent expansion of some old facilities from 1890 that now included several warehouses and chambers. One of these chambers, originally built as a shelter, was the place that these specialists believed had the suitable characteristics to establish the first tracer team.
I believe this location was picked because tunnelling was going on in this area, so that could be used to hide what was actually going on and what the excavation was for. Given that they wanted to cover the bay, they wanted to be able to see across the bay and watch shipping en masse either in the bay or see shipping through the straits, then this was one of the ideal locations. Of course, you then have the problem with the Levanter cloud, and this is something that put me off looking in this area many years ago, because my belief was any observation post of this kind would have needed to be below the line of the Levant cloud at its worst.
Once the location had been chosen, Burley designed a complex with a structure based on one main element, a chamber 13.71 meters long, 4.87 meters wide and 2.44 meters high, with walls painted white in order to avoid a feeling of claustrophobia, and the floor covered with cork layers that served as noise and thermal insulation. It was a space of 163 cubic meters, 57,600 cubic feet, where a team of originally 5 persons had to live for a whole year. This chamber would serve as lodging, dining hall, and warehouse for provisions. There was also a huge cistern of around 37,800 litres, 10,000 gallons, and next to it, on the floor, there was a fountain with a drainage channel. In this chamber there were 2 doors. One led to a kind of access tunnel that stretched down to the main tunnel of the battery that, when the right time came, had to be properly sealed and perfectly hidden so that it was not found. The other door led to some sort of shelf. On the shelf's right there was a chamber that hosted the radio, and on its left there was another chamber used as a toilet. Further on there was a flight of stairs that led to the upper levels. At the end of the stairs there was the eastern observation post. In the middle of them there was another flight of stairs that led to the western observation post. In addition to allowing the observers and their optical apparatus to watch almost all the sensitive naval sectors of the area, these small openings of 30.4 by 15.2 centimeters allowed the proper ventilation of the complex. Needless to say, it was almost impossible to see it from the outside, which proves the fact that it remained unnoticed during more than half a century. In addition to mentioning all the details of the location and giving a thorough description of the complex, the report that Burley sent to the Naval Intelligence Division included the technical details of its building and camouflage, suggestions on the lodging, warehousing and sanitation needs, and different recommendations on the electronic devices and their use, among others. This document was incorporated into the dossier that the British Naval Intelligence was gathering in order to improve even the smallest details of the operation. The Chief of the Naval Intelligence soon gathered a group of experts that included medical doctors, explorers, staff with thorough knowledge of expeditions to extreme habitats, and specialists in communication, among others. The Naval Intelligence sent Cordo to Gibraltar in autumn of 1941 because of all the issues that arose and the need to study in situ the conditions in which the transmissions had to take place. While gathering the information requested by London and making the expected verifications, Cordo was able to check the progress achieved in the excavations and the retrofit of the complex. On the 27th of December 1941, Cordo signed his report to Admiral Godfrey. As Cordo already knew, the work plan developed by Fordham gave the highest priority to the area where the transmission equipment had to be placed. This fact was determined by the need to start the transmission tests as soon as possible, and deciding not only on the characteristics and uses of the radios, but also on the conditions under which the communication between the military hidden inside this particular Gibraltarian Trojan horse and London had to take place. It had to be taken into account that every building work in Gibraltar had to be finished by mid-February 1942. Once Cordo had finished his work, Godfrey would also send Captain Sandwith, DDSDY, to Gibraltar with the mission of studying and testing all the technical aspects of the transmission and, with Burley's help, specifying the way in which those transmissions had to be organised. In order to choose the appropriate equipment, Sandwith had the help of Colonel Richard Gambier Parry, one of the best experts in long-distance communications and transmissions from the Secret Intelligence Service. On the 11th of January 1942, only 2 weeks after getting the Cordo report, London received the Sandwith report on the equipment. According to this report, the transmissions could be trusted to a standard transmitter Mark III and to an HRO receiver, which were easy to find in the Gibraltar military warehouses of that time. Its installation was possible because it only needed a space 1.22 meters long, 0.61 meters high, and 0.45 meters wide. It would operate with 3 small 12-volt, 120-amp batteries, rechargeable with 2 generators activated by physical strength, 1 manual and another one connected to a bicycle that was powered by pedaling. With regard to the transmissions themselves, after several trials, the suitable frequency for the transmission was found to be around 12 megacycles in the daytime and 7 megacycles at night. The only concern was that the communication could only be established after spreading out an aerial outside the rock, a bar-shaped aerial, 5.48 meters long. Certainly it would have been insane to install it permanently, even if they covered it with the best camouflage. The only solution was to spread it out through one of the hills at the moment of the transmission and remove it when the communication was over. This, as well as the searching of the area, posed a real risk for them, since the enemy could have listened to their conversations and tried to find them. However, those were risks they had to take. In mid-February, and in order not to waste any more time, Gambier Perry suggested that while one of his own men was sent from England, a specialist in transmissions from the garrison WT should immediately start the transmission tests with the recommended equipment and in the proposed way. The tests were done, and so it was possible to prove that the security service was incapable of detecting the transmissions. All in all, the mission had been planned out, and by the end of 1942, the place, the equipment, and the way of operating had already been decided. Then it was time to choose the most important element of the operation, the men who would carry it out. On the 25th of January 1942, the Chief of Naval Intelligence, Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, called for a new important conference to be held in London by the commands and the advisors of the Naval Intelligence to deal with the imminent launch of Operation Tracer. Under the chairmanship of Godfrey, 4 persons gathered together. Lord Horder, former Doctor of the Royal House and intelligence officer, author of a thorough report on the operation. George Murray Levick, Surgeon Commander of the Royal Navy, whose experience in polar expeditions, including the ones led by the famous Scott, and long stays in isolated places, turned him into a useful and authoritative opinion to improve the operation. Colonel Cawdor, and someone unknown called Ian Fleming, to whom the experiences of those years would be very useful in his future career as a writer. At that meeting they dealt with very different matters such as the uniforms and personal basic impedimenta for the mission, the kind of diet and the way of rationing the food and water, the consumption of alcohol and tobacco, and the total amount of food and different supplies needed. Among the hygiene-related matters, they talked about equipment and medicines, treatment of diseases, emergency surgeries, and even the possible death of one of the members of the group. Being isolation the main principle to keep the secret, the solution in those cases could not be other than embalming the body and cementing it into the walls in situ. In order to do so, they had bricks and cement inside the cave. One of the most alarming questions in which Levick's experience was very important was the psychological resistance the soldiers needed to live for 1 year in isolation in a reduced space.
One can only imagine what it must have been like to actually live inside this prison for about 1 year with 5 other men, knowing full well that at any moment the Germans would storm into this room and shoot everyone as spies. Psychologically, it must have been hell.
Clearly, all that was required was the recruiting of persons with certain stability and very special physical and above all psychic conditions. Furthermore, in the meeting they talked about the group's time management, the absolute and rational distribution of time, the way of dealing with leisure time, and the kind of reading material they needed to have, among other questions. Finally, although originally it had been considered that this first tracer team had to have 5 members, at this meeting they accepted that it needed 6. An officer who would act as the chief of the group, 3 specialists in transmissions, and 2 doctors, all of them, of course, from the Royal Navy. In addition to getting from and sending to Gibraltar the required supplies, the Naval Intelligence Division would ask the Admiralty to choose the chief of the group and the specialists. The choice of the doctors was entrusted to Lord Mauder and Levick. Finally, as it was an entirely new operation, Levick's suggestion was accepted. He thought it was wise to make a pilot rehearsal of the whole experience so as to prove the reactions of the selected staff. Although they thought of Scotland, where the British commandos and most official agents were traditionally trained, they finally chose Shotley Village on the east coast of England. On the 1st of March 1942, the Naval Intelligence told the First Lord of the Admiralty, Admiral Sir Alfred Dudley Pound, that his order was the only one remaining to begin the recruitment and training of the men. If everything went as planned, the first tracer team could begin its training in mid-May, and 2 months later, its operation in Gibraltar. Godfrey's trust in the success of the operation was so great that he offered to send the naval commanders of the threatened sensitive areas a manual with all the details and information needed to organize their own Operation Tracer. This manual, identified by the key ID 1001-107/42 and camouflaged for safety reasons as suggestions to organize an expedition to the Arctic, is a valuable study of the operation as a whole. All the problems related to the building and adjustment of the observation posts, the selection of the staff, the lighting, the ventilation, or the hygiene-related matters are described in detail in 12 appendices that deal with even the titles of the books that the members of the group had to have in their bookcase. Once they were sure the secret observation post of the western axis of the Mediterranean had been launched, their next priority would be to do the same in the eastern axis. The chosen place was the British colony of Aden on the Yemeni coast, a strategic possession equidistant from the Suez Canal and India. While the British Naval Intelligence was mounting the operation, 2 events of particular importance to the development of the war took place. The first one was the defeat of the German lightning campaign at the gates of Moscow. The second one was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which led to the United States definitively entering the war. Great Britain began to feel there was someone else there after so many years of apparent solitude. Though it was true that the paralyzation of the German advance to Moscow had destroyed the myth about the Wehrmacht's invincibility, both camps knew that would not remain the key defeat that put an end to the Russian adventure of Napoleon. Amid the snow, the German divisions had stayed on the ground and had contained the crisis. Nobody doubted the Germans still had enough reserves and morality to resume their attacks the following spring and end up winning in the east, perhaps in autumn 1942. There were still many months to go before the United States could deploy all its power to the western theatre of operations, especially because at that moment they had to face the unstoppable Japanese advance in the Pacific. Because of such an advance, the launch of Operation Tracer coincided with the seizing of Hong Kong, Malaysia, and chiefly the Singapore base, all British possessions, by the Japanese. The advance had been so quick that some people could do nothing but regret how useful it would have been if the Royal Navy had been capable of keeping one tracer team active in the occupied Singapore, even when suffering losses was never something good. In those days, Sir Dudley Pound himself wrote that, in the future, an operation developed from this model, Tracer, will have a permanent place in the defence of all the main ports. Regrettably, Singapore was already lost, but the First Sea Lord of the Admiralty confirmed the suitability of the highly innovative operation by approving the future settlement of tracer teams in Colombo and in the port of Trincomalee. Both of them were important enclaves located on the western and northeast coast of Sri Lanka, respectively. As regards the Mediterranean, the Admiralty's intention to establish tracer teams in the entrance and the exit of the Red Sea and on the island of Malta was facing growing difficulties. In spring 1942, Malta was being so persecuted that it could not devote any effort to the necessary retrofitting works. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Port Said, and even Aden, the effects of the counter-offensive launched by Rommel by the end of January only gave way to rely on what could be achieved by the local deployment of the existent intelligence services. In addition to this, there were the consequences of a decisive German victory in the east and the crucial success of Rommel in North Africa. Taking this into account, it is easy to understand the naval intelligence's renewed interest in having a tracer team in Gibraltar as soon as possible.
About a year after the caving group discovered the complex of rooms, that a gentleman, Mr. Dennis Woods, was visiting Gibraltar and had obviously heard that Stay Behind Cave had been discovered, and he made himself known to the caving group, and it turned out that he was a plasterer as part of the construction team that were responsible for building the network of chambers. He was led to believe that there was an Irish construction team had built the system of chambers, but other than that he was completely unaware of who or how or why or where, and they were all shipped back to Ireland, and nobody was aware of anything.
The recruiting of the members for the first tracer group began by the turn of the spring of 1941, even before knowing the identity of the officer who would act as the chief. These members were 3 leading signalmen and 2 surgeon lieutenants. One of them was a 26-year-old surgeon lieutenant called Bruce Cooper, who had been enlisted in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve before the outbreak of war. Cooper had had his baptism of fire as HMS Versatile's medical officer in 1940, when his ship was assaulted by the Luftwaffe while it was escorting the ship in which Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands was escaping. As he would remember over half a century afterwards,
Commander Murray Levick, he interviewed me, and to start with was very secretive about what it was about because it was so hush-hush. But finally it transpired that I was going to get a job in Gibraltar, a cover job, but my main thing in Gibraltar was that if the Germans came over from Spain and took Gibraltar, I was to disappear up to the cave at the top of the rock and lock myself in. When I knew I was going to do this, I was asked by Murray Levick if there was another doctor that I would like with me. I said, well, there's Arthur Milner, but at the moment he is a medical officer at Lancaster Infirmary. When I rang him and suggested that he join the Navy and join me, he said, I can't because I'm always seasick. So Murray Levick rang him and said, if you join the Navy to join us, I will guarantee that you'll never have to go to sea. So he joined us.
On the 30th of April, all members of the group, with the exception of the chief officer, were recruited, and under Levick's supervision, the training period started in the second fortnight of May in Shotley. Meanwhile, the Admiralty proceeded to gather all the supplies and necessary equipment in Gibraltar. As soon as the members of this first team had barely left Great Britain, the orders to initiate a rapid training of a second team were issued. On the 1st of August 1942, the tracer team was established in Gibraltar under the supervision of the garrison's SO-1. At that time, this position was held by Commander Pike Knott. All members of the team were aware that at any time the operation could begin, and they would have to hide in the observation post, facing the idea of being confined in one place where they would not have the chance to walk in the open for a year.
I like the idea of being locked up in the cave and spying on the Germans. Because in that cave, of course, I had a perfect view of both Gibraltar harbour on one side and the Mediterranean on the other. And I could spot all the German ships coming and going. And then I had a long cable which I dropped out of one of the portholes to which I could communicate with the Admiralty. I didn't feel scared or frightened, I felt excited.
All the members of the tracer team had been allocated different postings in the base in order to go unnoticed.
My undercover job here in Gibraltar was medical officer of health. If the word Tracy was mentioned, it would mean that I would have to go up to the cave and stay there indefinitely.
Soon after the team's arrival, the 3 officers were taken to the tracer complex.
I had this room at the back of the hotel, and these army personnel came in and told me that I was going up to the cave, and I would have to wear an army uniform, which they produced for me, and be dressed as a soldier to get through the security barrier up at the rock.
During several months, the members of the tracer team led a life similar to that of any member of the Gibraltar garrison. They complied with their duties in their respective postings, and during their free time, they visited the nearby villages of La Linea, Algeciras, and San Roque. While on duty on the rock, they suffered a bombing by the Italian 4-engined planes of the Bruno Mussolini squadron and learnt about the submarine attacks carried out by the manned torpedoes of the Ossa Maggiore flotilla. This flotilla operated from the Italian merchant ship Altera, which was anchored in the Algeciras dock. The rest of them just confined themselves to the monotony of life in the base.
I did think at the time that I would be wearing my naval uniform, which indicated that I was a doctor. And if the Germans were honourable gentlemen, I would have been all right. But I realised that the Germans may not have been ordinary gentlemen, and that if I was a spy, they would have shot me.
Throughout 1942, a series of events which were especially important for the development of the war took place in the Mediterranean theatre of operations. Meanwhile, the tracer members stayed in Gibraltar waiting to be activated.
Through time, as I got involved in local history, and I managed to befriend a family who their father was one of the officers in intelligence involved in the operations in that Tracer or Monkey's case operations. I found out that through the documents they gave me a set of plans of a cave which seems to be bigger than the one up recognized as Tracer Cave. I can tell you that the one of the officers that was from the Royal Navy, by the name Lieutenant Collins Vaughan, he was one of the gents involved, but unfortunately getting information out of those individuals was an impossibility.
In the north of Africa, Rommel had started the year with a new offensive that made the British retreat to the Egyptian border. It was a brave blow that would be followed by an equally amazing one, which would take him to the gates of Alexandria, where all the invested effort ended up with his supplies. The British took advantage of that moment to launch the powerful counter-offensive that would finally mean the beginning of the end for the Axis' presence in Africa. Furthermore, using Gibraltar as an advanced foothold, the North Americans would finally join the Western theatre of operations and disembark in French Morocco in the same rearguards as Rommel's. The centralization of assets in the colony, the vital use of its airfield to support the aerial coverage of the operation, and the frenetic activity of those days in the whole base could not remain unnoticed for the tracer members stationed on the rock. It is true that the Germans seemed to be culminating their summer offensive in Russia with the seizure of Stalingrad, although the general feeling was that everything was beginning to go well for the Allies. This feeling had become true before the ending of the winter 1942-43. By the Volga, the German spearhead in the south of Russia had been destroyed in a disaster of strategic proportions, which was about to defeat the whole Eastern Front. While in the north of Africa, the remains of the formerly proud Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in mid-May. But beyond all these major adversities, it was the Wehrmacht defeat in the plains of Kursk that irreversibly confirmed the inclinations in favor of the Allies. In the Mediterranean, the North Americans and the British got ready for lambing into what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. On the 10th of June 1943, they disembarked in Sicily, and around mid-August they had taken control of the island. Since the days of Operation Torch, the Allies had offered Spain some guarantees, and the Germans could just allow themselves some defensive-related plans with regard to the peninsula. It is true that in several opportunities Gibraltar was mentioned again, but this never came true. At the end of the spring of 1943, the risk of losing control of the Mediterranean key points had virtually disappeared. All these factors caused the implementation of Operation Tracer in Gibraltar to lose much of its purpose. As a matter of fact, on the 24th of August 1943, some days after the triumphant entrance of the American troops in Messina confirmed the defeat of Sicily, the Naval Intelligence Division extended a secret message to the people in charge of Tracer in Gibraltar so that they proceeded to the permanent annulment of the operation, the distribution of the stored supplies, and the closing of the accesses to the underground complex. 53 years had to go by until a group of people passionate about their local history found the place and started to gather the documentation and testimonies that made it possible to rebuild the story. However, there are mysteries that remain unsolved. According to Dr. Cooper's testimony, the image he blurry keeps in his mind from the moment he, together with the officers involved in the operation, in 1942 visited the place which would serve them as shelter, is that of a relatively small room with a tiny opening on one of its walls from where it was possible to see part of the city and the detached mole. On the opposite side there was another opening made with a pick which faced the Mediterranean. However, this chamber did not face any tunnel, did not have any annexed room, and above all, this place was neither below nor close to any artillery battery. This description has led to speculation, since it did not fit that of the complex discovered in 1996. It's possible, although unlikely in light of the available documentation, that the Naval Intelligence Division assigned 2 independent tracer teams to Gibraltar, each one with their own observation post. It's possible that another tracer team was created within the garrison on the initiative of the naval officer responsible for such sector, and following the suggestions pointed out in the well-known manual dispatched from London. It's likely too that the naval intelligence would decide to keep the real observation post in secret as a safety measure and in order to avoid any indiscretion, and that they showed the team another place which would be superficially equipped so as to appear convincing. However, above all this, it is clear that the tracer operations were a reality, whose value was recognised both by the Chief of the British Naval Intelligence, Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, and the First Lord of the Admiralty, Admirals Alfred Dudley Pickman Rogers Pound. It is also clear that, far from being just a plan, a first tracer team was organised, and its posting was the British colony of Gibraltar, where the chosen place to house them is still preserved. And even though the use of tracer teams was proposed in many other places, Gibraltar was the only place where this operation was certainly deployed and arranged in order to be activated should the situation require it. The data and experiences gathered during the study and training phases made up the content of the manual on which the British Naval Intelligence would later rely to consider the use of these devices. All this information turns the rock into the experimental place of the tracer missions. Fortunately, the evidence of Operation Tracer has reached us through the information stored in the British archives and through the memories of one of its main figures. However, the remains of the device that was buried under the Rock of Gibraltar for half a century constitute the most important piece of evidence. Nowadays, these remains have a huge evocative power and probably hide some other surprise. It's no wonder that with good judgment, the authorities pretend to preserve them. They are clearly aware that these remains constitute a valuable element of the thrilling legacy that the Second World War left to the rock.
I am of the opinion that there is more than one cave in Gibraltar.
In Gibraltar, there are still many mysteries to solve and episodes to document. But as every researcher knows, each door has its key, and with persistence, effort, and some luck, it is certain that, as happened with this case, the key that will bring some light to this matter will eventually be found.